We're going to start looking at empathy this afternoon for some of you. So now that you've taken some time considering your personal motivation that we went through last week, and you've maybe crafted that big overall why statement, we'll begin working on how to better understand the groups of people that will benefit from your project. And this should be a fairly natural progression, right? When we have a solid understanding of our motivation and the purpose of our project, we should be able to identify who will benefit. Those people are likely a large part of your motivation, actually. But it's also important to widen the scope and also consider those who are outside of our target audience who may be indirectly impacted. If you'll recall that change formula we talked about last week, that requires us to evaluate levels of support and resistance that we might come up against. So it's important to have a good understanding of where that might be coming from. And there's also some great questions on page 28 in your workbook that really get the wheels turning as you look more closely at these populations. All right, so just a few brief notes about empathy. What I've got here is according to Brené Brown. If you're not familiar with Brené Brown, I highly suggest you look her up. You won't regret it. She's an adorable, sassy Texan lady who is a researcher and a social worker. But she says that there's these 4 key steps when you're practicing empathy that I think are helpful to keep in mind. First one is perspective taking, right? You're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's kind of what we all understand. Another key part of that is staying out of judgment and listening. I think the staying out of judgment piece can also come up later when we're talking about assumptions. There's a spot on your canvas to write down what are some of the assumptions that you're making. That might be something that you include there. What assumptions do you have about the population you're working with, and how might that limit you? And then you also want to recognize emotion in another person that you've maybe felt before. So these groups that you're working with, you may not understand what it's like to be in their position, but we're all human. We all experience the same emotions, essentially. So you might be able to connect with having experienced similar emotions, even if you've not been in their position. And then it's important also to be able to communicate that you can recognize that emotion. All right, so how do we use empathy in this process? Ideally, you're going to have the opportunity to interact on multiple levels with your target audience and those who will be impacted by your project. After hopefully gathering some existing data, you might recall the process and some of the suggestions and recommendations in the inputs block from last week. But then you can begin with observation and putting together some context for the populations you're working with, right? And then those observations may lead you to some really helpful questions based on what you see that you'd like to either ask yourself, ask your team members, or ask your audience. And that's when you move into engagement, these direct interactions with your audience, maybe interviews, maybe listening sessions, or just even casual conversations out in the community. And then if possible, you can immerse yourself into the experiences of your audience. Now, that one can be a little trickier. Not every project is different, and the process is going to vary quite a bit between projects. But it's crucial to do what it is that you can. Ask yourself how you can observe, how you can engage, how you can immerse. Maybe that data already exists. Maybe somebody's already done that part, and then you can build off of that. So I'm sure this is not news to you, and we're just preaching to the choir, but we have developed a tool to help with this as you go through this process. So this here you're seeing is the persona worksheet created to help kind of wrap your mind around the general understanding of the groups of people you're working with, you're working towards impacting. Now, I'm going to be honest, I won't lie, I really struggled with this persona worksheet for the first few go-arounds in this. And I'm a trained therapist, and empathy is kind of my gig. So I struggled. I just couldn't get past the feeling that I was stereotyping and making assumptions by filling this out. But I've realized a few things since then. If you attempt to complete this without having observed, engaged, and immersed yourself in some way with your audience, then you're probably going to struggle, and it's not going to be very helpful or accurate. The other tactic that's helped me, now maybe this won't connect with you, but just throwing out there my interpretation of this, what I've done to get past that sense of stereotyping is that I envision my whole general audience in front of me. Okay, it's diverse and it's varied and it's representative of everyone that my team can possibly think of that might be impacted by our project. And then I imagine specific individuals stepping forward, and one by one, they sit down with me and they tell me their story. And what you get from that story is what you use to fill in the chart. Now, obviously, what you're imagining in these scenarios, if you decide to do it that way, is going to be based on the research you've done and on the engagement that you've had with your audience. But it's one way to look at this. And we can look at an example here on the next slide. So this might be kind of difficult to see on your screen, but essentially what we're looking at here is an example that provides some context for a farmer. So the bio section is specifically related to this general population's experience with technology, USDA programs. The interests, likes, and dislikes are also related to that focus. And some other examples here that you want to think about what a typical day is like and how that ties into the project focus as well. So we're not needing a full family history. We don't need to know their favorite color. Don't need to know whether they prefer the toilet paper to go over or under. This is just a tool designed to get your wheels turning, to be thinking outside the box, and to help you recognize and fill in some of the gaps that are inevitably present in all our projects. So I encourage you at the very least to ask yourselves, how have you or how can you observe, engage, or immerse with your participants and your audience? And how are you integrating those experiences into your project? So with that, I will
see you next week.